Welcome to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy.
Hi, everyone.
Sarah and I spent the last 25 years working with leaders across the United States and around the world to build trauma-informed workplaces and transform service delivery for nonprofit, government, and for-profit organizations that really exist for the purpose of helping people. In this podcast, we share our insights, experiences, and knowledge to inspire leaders and other professionals to put these ideas into practice.
We've been talking in our last few episodes about what a healthy society looks like and what gets in the way of creating healthy societies. Today, we're going to talk about collective memory and what happens to memory when groups of people experience traumatic events. And this can happen through cultural, historical, and racial trauma. Our work has focused on systems, organizations, and the larger service sectors in which we operate. So we're going to use some examples of those settings in our conversation today. And later, we're going to talk about some of the ways that we use creating presence to retrieve, challenge, and repair collective memory through a skill we call restoring.
Yeah, for learning to occur, communities have to have memory. Um, William Faulkner, in his play Requiem for a Nun, he said, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." Some modern philosophers believe that all memories are formed and organized within a collective context. And according to them, society provides the framework really for our beliefs and behaviors and the recollections then of both individuals and groups. Later, present circumstances, then whatever's going on in the present, affects what events are remembered as significant. And much of the recording and recalling of memories occurs through social discussion. So the shared cohesiveness of memories is part of what actually defines a culture over time. Shared language also helps a society organize and kind of assimilate memories and eventually forget about the events, particularly the bad events. So organizational memory refers to stored information from an organization's history that can be brought to bear on whatever's happening in the present, like individual memory. Organizational memory is distributed throughout all of the people. It's not concentrated in one place or one domain.
And it's weird what memories get stored and where they get stored. And I have an example of kind of a weird institutional memory. At a residential program where I worked, we had this event every year in the spring. And it was usually held in May. And so, the weather was unpredictable at that time of year. It could be really, really cold. It could be really, really hot. You never really knew. And on this one particular year that we had this event, it was really hot. It was like in the low 80s. So a bunch of the kids from one of the residential programs showed up wearing shorts. Like, no big deal. It was a fine day. Everyone had fun, all that, kind of uneventful. Things went smoothly. But then the next day, one of the staff members approached the head of that program and said, I noticed that all your boys were wearing shorts. Did the memo come out? I didn't see the memo. And he was like, what are you talking about? And she went on to describe that, every year there was a memo that was distributed from leadership, at least in her perspective, like her interpretation, right? That it was not okay for the kids to wear shorts until the memo came out that said, now we can wear shorts. And what was really interesting is that this leader of this program was like, I'd never seen that memo. I had no idea that this was something that got decided at an executive level, right? What the kids can wear. It's like, I thought that as staff, we kind of like figure that out based on, the weather, the temperature. But it really was fascinating because it turned out that, like, there had been an issue where some of the staff were complaining that they were getting into conflict with the kids about what they could and couldn't wear. And so rather than, managing that conflict at the level it was happening, the leadership team had taken it into their own hands at one point to say, like, we will decide, what point in the year we will allow shorts, and then no one has to deal with it. We'll kind of deal with it at that level. And he said, I'm not sure what kind of shorts related disaster might have triggered this response. But he'd never seen an announcement about shorts. And so it became, maybe it happened once, but it became part of the institutional memory, and then, like, got pulled into practice. It became like how they do things. And so I can just imagine there were, all of these staff and all of these kids who were anxiously waiting to get the green light to, dress appropriately for the weather.
Oh, that's such a great example. There are all kinds of failures in memory storage. So one investigator studied a whole bunch of companies and showed that organizations kept repeating their mistake and their blunders for two main reasons. They had either lost their corporate memory and were incapable of recalling their corporate history, and that they called time-based memory loss, or they were unable to communicate lessons from one part of the organization to another part in a timely manner. And they call that space-based memory loss. So time-based memory loss occurs when learning that has taken place fails to be encoded and documented, and thus whatever knowledge is represented is lost over time, while space-based memory loss occurs when learning, even when it has been encoded and documented, it's not shared or it's not diffused to all of the people that need to know about it.
Yeah, and I think it helps to recognize that, the memory loss, or what we call organizational amnesia, can result from a breakdown in any of the stages of learning. And there are four stages of learning. Those are intuition, interpretation, integration, and institutionalization. Intuiting, which is really kind of at the individual level, is reliant on, the individual staff members kind of intuiting potential learning from the environment, kind of tuning into what's going on, and then kind of using their own prior experiences and, making some meaning out of what's happening. Interpreting is when that person then kind of names what they've intuited, compares it against their own previous knowledge or experience, and then goes through this process of sense making. And the next one is integration. And this is really where, like, the individual and the group come together. And it's about kind of meaning making that happens through communication. So an individual learns something, makes meaning of it, and then shares it with other people, and they interpret it and make meaning of it in a way that allows them to adjust how they practice. And this often happens in pockets across an organization. It doesn't happen, across the board. That's where institutionalization happens. So group of people try something, learn something, and then if it's successful, it gets penetrated in a much larger way. And then it becomes, concrete. So routines, policies, formalized practices happen from that learning and get disseminated and distributed.
Yeah, this may sound to people kind of academic, but there's some concepts and ideas that you have to have about the subject, because what we're really talking about is that organizations can develop dementia.
Yeah.
Really, that's in a person, It's about, memory loss and not being able to hang on to things that you knew. And the same thing happens in organizations. So some other terms that are really vital are the difference between tacit and explicit memory. So there are many mechanisms for conveying knowledge, but there may be no mechanism in the organization for conveying the intuitive knowledge of individuals that needs to be transferred to the organization. So, or individual intuition may be looked down on. So people who try to bring things up in a meeting, everybody's hurried, everybody's rushing. People say, well, I remember when, oh, shut up, Sandy, enough already. And that effectively silences people. That results in time-based memory loss. Tacit knowledge, it's often in the form of skills or corporate wisdom, is a lot more difficult to transfer than explicit knowledge. So that much that goes on at a tacit level may not be transferred to other parts of the organization, and that causes then space-based memory loss. Tacit knowledge often resides in the the memories of the oldest people in the organization. And therefore, it's often ignored and lost in our culture. Not like Native American cultures are much better at conveying elder stories than we are. And as an elder, I can attest to this. It's a big problem. Integration and institutionalization may help the organization retain explicit information that's gained over time. But that tacit information that's really embedded in the memories of the people is much more easily lost. And when that happens, the way you know that's happening is that rules replace norms as guides for the group, and the rules then become institutionalized. So if we don't understand why a practice was institutionalized, often because the people who created it are no longer present, then we're likely to make mistakes in causal relationships. And then things that no longer make sense have become rules for everyone that everybody has to follow. Kind of like your example of the shorts norms.
Right. I have another example, even more, recent, which is around in my outpatient clinic, how we manage cancellations. And so and this was really a failure at the institutionalizing level of creating memory and learning. And when people would cancel, we would click a cancel button, and then unfortunately we had a glitch in our billing system, and so people were getting billed for appointments that they had canceled. So as a way to repair that, in my office, we just started deleting them instead of canceling them, so we could avoid having that problem. But then what didn't occur to anyone was that if we were deleting the appointments, then that was affecting what our workload looked like. And so then those of us who were using the delete method were then getting assigned brand new patients to fill those spots because they looked like they were empty. And that caused a whole other problem. So the real fix was about, fixing the glitch, but there were also so many layers of communication that made that feel impossible that, we ended up like creating a bigger problem with a solution that worked to kind of create a smaller, to fix a smaller problem. And I think that happens a lot. And then when new people come on and they're like, okay, so what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to cancel it? Am I supposed to delete it? We're all like, we don't know. Right? You can't get it right either way. So, go for it. And that basically meant that there was no real clarity for any of us about what or how to do this in a way that didn't cause, a bigger problem on either end.
And what actually happened with the patient, right?
Right.
Nobody, right.
Right, exactly.
And I think there's so much of that because of all of the use of electronic communication. It's really helped and it's really hindered. Then there's the downsizing of memory, right? Organizational or corporate amnesia has become a tangible problem that everybody has to reckon with. When there's a loss of collective experience and accumulated skills through excessive downsizing and layoffs. So everybody that walks out the door takes their memory of everything that happened with them. So it's generally recognized that corporate layoffs can have devastating effects, not just on the person who leaves, but on corporate health, the health of the whole organization, even producing what has been termed survivor sickness in the business world. It's it's the valuable tacit memory that is so profoundly disturbed by the loss of people as a result of downsizing. According to people who have really looked at this and investigated this, the average length of a US employee's tenure with any given company, and this was before COVID, is approximately 5 years. So what these investigators wrote on, I'll quote from them, the dramatic shift in the nature of employment toward short-term tenure is among the biggest damaging influences on productivity and competitiveness in companies today. That's because short-term tenure translates into short-term organizational memory. And when a company loses its medium and long-term memory, it repeats its past mistakes, fails to learn from past successes, and often forfeits its identity. Hard-won and expensively acquired organizational memory walks out the door every time an employee retires, quits, or is downsized.
Yeah, corporate memory loss at any level is significant, but a lot of the research describes that when it happens at the leadership level, it's even more impactful. And that's because senior team members hold a strategic place in the organization. They hold the vision for the future direction, and they are smaller, right? Executive teams are usually smaller than the rest of the staff, and they hold more power. So the decisions they make have a greater global impact throughout the organization. And like individuals, leadership teams or organizations as a whole can distort or entirely forget the past if they were even there when the past happened, right? And I think, I'm often the person at that table who's like, yes, this is an interesting idea, but we did try this 5 years ago before any of you were here, and here's what happened, right? So I'm like you, Sandy. I feel like I'm always the old timer in the room, and it's hard and it's frustrating, and people often don't welcome it because, and we're also so focused on this idea of innovation that we want to try new things, and I'm always, on board with that, but not if it's something that we've tried 5 times before with tragic, terrible outcomes. And it's also hard, I think, because when things haven't gone well, and or sometimes if they've gone tragically or disastrously, we're even less likely to remember those situations because we push them out of our conscious awareness.
Right. And then there's the way we do things around here issue. Much of tacit memory in organizations is passed on through the mechanism of organizational culture. And it's just what the norm is. The informal organizational knowledge, though, about what that's about is lost when people leave, particularly the long timers, particularly the leaders, as you talked about. And particularly if they have not passed on, why do we do things that way? Why is it the way things are around here? So culture, then, the organizational culture is massively affected by layoffs, program closures, leadership changes. Organizational structure, all the structured things tends to be more lasting, but the structure and the function, why we do things, may cease to inform each other, so that the structure itself just becomes meaningless and repetitive and hollow, because the tacit information formerly embedded in what you and I would call clinical wisdom has left the system. So it doesn't inform the structure anymore. So that even the knowledge that seems embedded in the walls of an institution is lost when the physical structures themselves are torn down, or when the entire program moves to a new and in our world frequently quite diminished location. So, and even changing leaders, even changing the entire staff doesn't erase the organizational memory, nor does it excavate and provide any kind of decent burial for the skeletons that usually reside in the organizational closet.
Yeah, I am thinking about a new therapist who came on board in my organization, and I'm supervising her, and she asked me, can I look at some of your patient charts to to get a sense of how the work went, because I was passing a client that I'd worked with, transferring this person to her, and I was like, oh, well, you can, but that's not going to help. I was like, it's really better if we have a meeting and, I talk you through, the work that we've done together and kind of give you a sense. And she was like, well, I can't just see it in the chart. I was like, oh, no, you certainly cannot. And it's interesting because, organizational memory and clinical memory, we think that they're kept in the files and records of our institutions, or our clinical work, but what gets archived is really sketchy. And I think about, a patient's file is basically meaningless when what we're doing in the documentation is just satisfying some requirements of our funding sources, right? We need to think about how to justify continued care or
Absolutely.
level of care. And so really what we're documenting is what the symptoms are and what intervention we're doing. And there's some value in that, but it really doesn't say anything about what's happened, why, the formulation of, what's really going on. And we don't do that in our organizational history either, right? We can't look in any file to see what happened, why someone left, like what traumatic event happened. There's no real way that we capture that except through the people who live it,
Right.
and the stories that we tell to each other.
That is so on target. When we were running an inpatient unit, we couldn't actually tell the truth in the charts, because as soon as we said anything about the person improving, then they had to go home. and
Right.
and missing the point entirely for why they were there and what the progress that was happening. So yeah, I mean, yeah, the system has made us systematically not tell the truth. And there are often no records, as you said, of what happens through any change in our system. No clinical chart or documentation of trauma, because then lawyers get involved. And so you have to really be careful about what you document. And nobody ever goes back after that phase is over and documents what has happened. So mental health and social service organizations are traumatized in many different ways: layoffs, closures, losses of funding, patient deaths, staff injuries, and all kinds of acts of violence. And it may not be possible to traumatize an institution without producing defects in organizational memory. right? In traumatized individuals, memory problems follow two main patterns, either too little or too much. So after a traumatic experience, people may develop amnesia for the worst aspects of the experience, while at the same time, fragments are intruding into their consciousness, flashbacks at inappropriate times. Either way, the trauma may radically interfere with current information processing and decision making and problem solving and life choices for individuals and for organizations.
Yeah, it really reminds me of what we talked about in an earlier podcast when we were focusing on cultural and historical trauma. And Judith Herman and other researchers have pointed out that we have to study traumatic stress in the political and social contexts. And we have to give voice to the people who are disempowered and disenfranchised. And the reality of this traumatic amnesia that we're talking about is because there's a gap in the social narrative. And if we had something to fill in those gaps, we would really better understand and be able to learn from the mistakes of the past, integrate, institutionalize, do those 4 stages of learning. But we can't, partly because for victims, dredging up those memories creates symptoms and makes them feel like they're re-experiencing or reliving them, so they don't want to talk about it. For witnesses, they don't want to hear about it. And for people in authority, they don't want to have to take responsibility for it. So, this social amnesia is particularly great when the trauma has occurred to oppressed or marginalized groups like women, children, historically minoritized people, and particularly people with mental illness.
And I think it's really important for people to recognize that with individuals, it can last a long time, this whole process of post-traumatic amnesia and then coming to terms with things and all kinds of intervening variables occur. But it's the same in organizations, so that there may be nobody who is still present when a previous traumatic event happened, but it's become embedded in the organizational memory, even though, and so people are mystified as to what's going on. Why are we doing things this way? Why do we react that way? And all the people that actually know the answers to those questions are long gone.
Thanks for listening to Creating Presence. Coming up after the break, we'll talk about the importance of restoring memory, and we'll take a question from one of our listeners. We'll be back after these messages.
In a world with trauma, adversity, and mental health deficits, your organization may be feeling the effects in its culture. Recognizing the need for safe, productive, and values-aligned organizations, Creating Presence can help to develop a healthy, biocratic organization. In the Creating Presence training model, your entire staff will learn to value human elements that characterize organizations, learn values that are solution-based and supportive, and implement new skills which will create capable leaders to meet the needs of staff and clients. For more information, go to www.creatingpresence.net. Creating Presence is managed by Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy. And today we're focusing on collective memory. And we're going to start this segment with a question from a listener. And this is the question. My workplace culture is tough on new hires. The higher-ups dump all unwanted projects on us and expect us to finish or resolve them in an unreasonable amount of time when we still have all of our other work to do. I get the feeling that leadership approves or doesn't care. There's this idea that you have to pay your dues before you earn respect from your team or your boss. It took me forever to find this job and I can't quit. How can I stand up for myself without getting fired or making things worse?
So I love this question. And I think it's probably one that a lot of people can relate to. And I actually think that it's related to collective memory. I imagine that this way of doing things really made a lot more sense when people stayed for long periods of time in their workplaces, right? You said in our last segment, 5 years is basically the average longevity. So in times past, it made sense for people to sort of earn their place in a culture where they were going to be there for a long time. I also suspect that this practice evolved from probably some traumatic event that happened in the organization, this workplace, probably financial disruption, layoffs, or downsizing. Um, and there's something too that reminds me of the like, well, if I had to do it, then they have to do it mentality, right? Like if I had to earn my place, then then everybody else who's new also has to learn their place, right? The kind of the way that learning got embedded around that value. And it also reminds me of the current political conversation about student loan debt forgiveness, right? There's a lot of that. Well, I had to pay off my student loans, so I don't want anybody else to have theirs forgiven. It's not fair. So those are some of the things that came up as I was listening to the question. But I think, to kind of focus in on the what can I do part of that question, there are three things that come to mind for me. One is a cognitive approach, right? Changing our thinking. Second is a communication approach. And the third is a relational approach. So the cognitive approach, I think, is really about, what do I do in my own mind to deal with this conflict? And how can I think about this differently? So some of the replacement thoughts that I might, generate if I were in this situation, and I have been in this situation, is, I'm going to do what I can do in the time that I'm given. If the respect of the higher ups is really important to me, and the only way that it looks like I can demonstrate my value is by overworking, but I am not able to do that, then I'm going to try to demonstrate my value in a different way, right? I'm going to be honest about what's possible. I'm going to communicate about the delays in completing projects, and I'm going to seek collaboration. Like I'm going to work in my own mind to think about how else I can demonstrate my value, right? So that's one approach. The second is taking a communication approach. So, I can approach the person who assigned me the project, describe the time that's required to do it, compare that to the time that's been allotted, and ask for help in prioritizing. And also maybe set some boundaries. And that might sound like, I can stay late 2 nights this week to get X done, but that's going to mean that Y gets pushed to next week. And I just want to be clear about that, right? Setting those boundaries through communication. The third approach is a relational approach. And so, if you're thinking about this on a bigger scale, right? Really understanding that this is a culture and climate issue, not a task related issue. One of the things that I might do and have done is to ask some of the people who've been there for a long time to tell you about their first years at the company, right? And focusing your questions on what made them stay. Also asking them about what's happened in the company since they've been there, right? Trying to understand their stories and the story of the organization, because that might offer some opportunities for change. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, think about how to change the story, because we're replaying this story that really doesn't fit for the current context, social, political, or otherwise. But this organization is really wedded to this story.
Yeah, and what is a story anyhow, right? Human beings have been telling stories as long as we've been human beings, as long as we could talk. Even before we had language, we were telling stories as evidenced by the images on the caves of these, Paleolithic cave things and musical instruments that go back thousands of years. So stories are built upon themes that are below the surface and that drive the plot of the story. And the story is the internal and external conflict. So you don't really have an interesting story unless there's some kind of conflict between the characters in the story, while the plot are the events. They are the events of the narrative. Story themes deal with big issues: love and faith, life and death, good versus evil, coming of age, power and corruption, survival, courage and heroism, prejudice, individual versus society, peace and war, innocence and guilt, alienation and belonging, the circle of life, suffering and betrayal. Story themes represent human universals and give the meaning behind the story that's then expressed through the plot and the journey that the characters go on through the story.
Sandy, you made me want to take a literature course, and I want you to be the professor. It sounds so compelling. But it also makes me think about Michael White, who is a social worker from New Zealand. And he has, done a lot of work on what's now understood and taught as narrative therapy. And he says that, the stories that people tell themselves and tell each other about their lives are really influencing how they behave in the present. And he teaches that when people only have access to one single story, one that really simplifies or flattens out the complexity of human experience and excludes lots of perspectives of other people being represented, they can get really constrained in their imaginations. So when people are kind of really limited to this one story, it keeps them as individuals, but also their culture locked in this inability to change. So narrative therapy, when we use it as a treatment modality, it focuses on increasing the complexity of stories and understanding all of the contextual aspects of a person's life story, including political, gendered, ethnic, religious, and lots of other forms of identity, those aspects of each person and of each culture.
Yeah, stories told in organizations are said to consist of the narrative itself as well as the moral to the story, right? And they reflect really deeply held assumptions that are being made and have been made in the past. And stories are value laden. Storytelling can be used in an attempt to control, dehumanize, and manipulate people, or to develop the self-potential and sense of well-being of employees. Either way, there's a primary focus in creating presence is to have organizations and the people who lead them be able to tell better stories and to change the outcomes of stories instead of just being like helpless characters in a sour plot. Stories are really powerful methods for change for four main reasons. One, we're finding out that they stimulate neurological changes that increase empathy, vitally important. Two, they personalize presentation content. They create connection between the listeners and the storyteller. Three, they open windows to really what is the intuitive knowledge of the audience without arousing as much conscious resistance as a direct communication about those very same themes, about what you should and shouldn't do kind of thing. And four, they can tap the resources of what you don't hear much about, but we know a lot about, the unconscious mind. So let's share some guidelines for engaging in a process that is both creative and rewarding. And that's when a different story is told.
Yes, in creating presence, we really try to focus on the power of stories and specifically those organizational stories. And so we use a process that's called restorying. And restorying falls into our complexity management skill category, partly because it really requires that we draw from lots of different sources to understand the full context, right? To move from an organization kind of operating from one story to a story that's much richer and creates, you know, the full narrative of what's happened or what's happening. So there are a couple of steps in restoring. We ask people to come together, usually leaders or teams where something has been going on or something distressing is happening within the system. And we start by asking them to tell the story as it is generally understood. Then we ask the people who are involved in the experience to talk explicitly about the feelings that were associated with the event before, during, and after it, right? So really recognizing that often what's happening when distressing things are happening in a program, it's because the feelings have gotten disconnected and they're landing in all these other places, and other people who weren't necessarily directly affected are feeling those feelings on behalf of the other people and acting them out. So really being able to identify the feelings and name them and give them voice.
Well, if you're in a leadership position, you're going to need to role model what you just described, right? A different approach that's currently than is currently probably available for your staff. But it also means you're going to have to tolerate and contain their frustration and anger or sadness that's a component of whatever the disturbance itself is. So you have to draw upon your own available expert voices that are around you to recognize the collective nature of whatever problem is occurring, and then get everybody together to really begin this restoring process.
In addition to the stuff about feelings, we also really want to use this process to talk about strengths of the people who were part of it, their inherent skills, and then retell the story. So again, if you're a leader, you need to make sure you have the support to do this in a way that allows you to be authentic, but also to really contain your own emotions, because often telling the story is painful. If you're not a leader, but you're using that relational approach that I was suggesting earlier about, you know, how to kind of change the climate or culture in this way, it's helpful if you ask about the feelings, the strengths, and also about the insights, about what's happened, and try to make connections between what's happened and how that's shaped how the culture is now.
Yeah, you begin with telling the story as you now understand the problem or the issue or the negative events, the story that is generally being told, even if it involves you and what you have or haven't done. Express what you've seen and how you've been interpreting it or ignoring it or explaining it away or blaming somebody else for it.
Yeah, there's often an element of externalizing in the stories that we're telling. And that, in my experience, often drives a feeling of helplessness, right? When we're blaming some outside villain for what's happening to us in our organizations, it can be helpful because then we don't feel responsible, but we also then don't feel like we have any power to do that. So we want to ask too, what have people been feeling? What has that done to the group? Are there splits that weren't there before, right? And by splits, we mean, are there silos within your team or your organization? Are there competitive forces that are happening that are driving people apart? We also want to ask, what might be most difficult to surface, and are the experiences of loss associated with whatever's going on in the environment? Because often it's unresolved grief that drives some of these stories.
And that grief can be quite puzzling. It's really important to remember that human beings can get attached to just about anything and anybody. And we usually hold ambiguous feelings about our attachments. So, like as an example, although it may appear on the surface that everybody was really happy to see so-and-so fired, they may each also have had an attachment to that person. And it's the loss that has been split off and then sent downward and creates disturbance in people underneath, below, in the surface. And it's always helpful to honor loss, any loss, and together kind of explore what else could be going on.
I want to give an example of restoring that I lived through. And what was happening was that my outpatient setting, it was a small, privately owned, small partnership of therapists. And we were bought out by a larger national conglomerate. And when that happened, there were all kinds of overwhelming feelings that came along with that, and loss of feeling, sense of control, concerns about whether or not our small company was even still going to exist in this larger system. Just lots and lots of distress, and people were really unhappy. Morale was really low. There were lots of errors, lots of client dissatisfaction, you name it. And so we as a team went through a lot of bumps, and there were a lot of people who left too. But there was a pretty solid core of us who stayed. And so we had to do this restoring process, because the original story, right? If we're going to kind of tell the story the way it's traditionally told, the story that was driving our unrest, it was basically that we had this lovely family-like environment that became part of a huge corporate monster with lots of layers of bureaucracy, and that is what diminished patient care, and drove our friends and colleagues out of our environment. So in the process of restoring, we had to acknowledge, number one, that story is awful. Like, no wonder we were miserable. Like that was basically the narrative that we were carrying around with us and enacting, right? We were pretty, heavy-hearted, if that's the story. But instead, we really started talking about the feelings that were happening, right? And most of the feelings were about fear of the unknown, fear about our survival, fear, professional survival, right? Which for many of us is, our professional identity is so important, that feels really threatening. And then the fear around loss of power. So once we were able to really name those feelings and kind of put them where they belonged, we started to construct a new story. And we did that by really looking at our strengths. So we talked about and honored and articulated how important our connections to each other were, our clinical wisdom. We did some things with those strengths. We created supervisors meetings. We developed trainings for new staff. We created a local onboarding process so that we could bring people into the culture that we wanted in our office. We started setting up monthly lunch meetings. We created office hours and peer supervision support. And we were really able to maintain this amazing collaboration. Like, I go to other people's office hours, they come to my office hours, and I'm not talking about like new hires coming to office hours. I'm talking about like us old folks who have been in the trenches for a long time, who are sort of the, the ones offering supervision. But we really, without any hesitation or judgment, all of us feel like I need to talk to Andrew. I'm working with a client who I feel really challenged by, and I know he's got the clinical wisdom that I need to tap into. So we're able to really create a new story.
I had a similar thing happen in a leadership position, because uh, leaders are often reluctant to talk about the bad things that are happening. They're trying to hold it and contain it themselves and feel like they need to protect their staff, right? And so they're going to hold on to it. But what happens, what I've experienced, is that actually everybody knows that there's something going on that is not a good story. But they don't have any way to think about it as a story with a beginning and a middle and an end, right? That stories change. And so it's so important. The only way I learned that was there was we were going to have, it was about loss, and I couldn't write the news story yet because we were going to have to leave our program for the second time. And I was holding it all myself. And there were all kinds of problems. All kinds of disasters were occurring with our patients, with the staff. It was a nightmare. And because I had a person visiting from the UK, she said, "Do you suppose it could have anything to do with the news that you just had?" And then I had to tell the story. And that began to change everything, and just the way you described it, right? Because we could think differently about how it was a whole consistent story. We'd been there before, and we could create a new story, which is eventually what we actually did. But it is a special role for leaders, I think, to understand that your group always knows. They know something. They just don't know, can't cognitively incorporate it because they don't know anything about what actually is happening.
I love that you're talking about the role of leadership, and you're so right about that. And there's also space and room for people who are not leaders to take the role of shaping the new story. And I wasn't a leader in the new conglomerate. There was a whole corporate entity that existed that, took us on, and we didn't have those titles or those roles, but we were, as a team, able to create a story that worked for us. And the way that I would tell the story now is, our little clinic became part of a much larger entity that initially generated some challenges through a pretty long adjustment period. But that created a lot of fear and uncertainty, but we really came together around our values. And that for me is where the story shifts so much. And then also recognizing that the growth allowed us to increase our capacity, access technology that we couldn't afford, and systems that we didn't have in place, while still allowing us to be a strong, cohesive team. And we're a lot more diverse now, and our larger size has allowed us to create a DEI team, create small learning communities around different kinds of practices that we're interested in. And there were some losses related to giving up what was familiar. But for those of us who stayed, we've been able to adapt and thrive and build an even bigger community of practice. So we hope that you will think about the stories of your organizations and yourselves as you integrate what we've been talking about today. Thanks so much for listening to Creating Presence. Join us next week when Sandy and I will talk more about what it means to create a healthy society. You can reach us at creatingpresence.net or voiceamerica.com. See you next week.